Just like Allen Iverson, Locked On Predators is pulling out the crossover. Yep, we're kicking off our series of Central Division crossovers with our friend Seth Tupal of Locked On Wild. We'll take a look at what's next for both teams after disappointing playoff exits, similarities between the way the Preds and the Wild were kicked out of the postseason, and we revisit the Kevin Fiala Mikhail Granlund trade. Yep, who really won that deal? We'll talk about that today on the Locked On Predators podcast.
Your Locked On Predators, your daily podcast on the Nashville Predators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Predators your first listen of the day. I'm Nick Morgan. I'm a writer and editor at ontheforecheck.com. I normally have a partner in crime, Ann Kimmel, but she is taking a well-deserved vacation, and you deserve it. Take your time, live it up. Instead, today, we're kicking off our series of Central Division crossovers. Yep, all throughout the offseason, we're going to be going one-on-one with the other Locked On hosts from across the Central Division. We're going to take a look at their future, maybe discuss some in-season storylines between that team and the Preds. A lot of fun stuff to look forward to. Today, we have Seth Tupal from Locked On Wild. That's a crossover I think a lot of you guys are going to be interested in because there's simply a lot of carryover between the Preds and Wild. We obviously have a bunch of former Preds there. Yep, they're basically Preds North. Some controversial trades between the two. The Fiala one, people still talk about it. And plus, we're each now proud members of the Screw Ryan Suter fan club. So there's a lot to get into today. A lot I think you guys will be interested in hearing. So without further ado, here's our crossover with Locked On Wild.
Great. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked On Wild. I'm joined by one of the hosts of Locked On Predators, Nick Morgan. Nick, this is the first time we've had a chance to do any sort of crossover collaboration, so glad to have you on. Unfortunately, both of us have had a chance to watch all of round two that has transpired so far because the Wild and the Predators both got bounced in round one.
Did we make the playoffs? I can't remember. I've blocked out everything that happened after the Preds went up 4-0 on the Arizona Coyotes the last game of the season. So I'm blissfully unaware of anything hockey related that happened to that. I assume we're in a great spot right now, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fun to watch the second round, but unfortunately, it'd be nice to be part of it. Predators losing to the Avalanche, the Wilds lost to the Blues. One of the things that I was curious about, because he kind of captivated a national audience in game two, that of course being Mr. Connor Ingram, who came in after a lackluster performance by David Rittich in relief of UC Saros, who was injured heading into the postseason. So goalie musical chairs, and you got a rookie goalie who stands on his head and just nearly wills his team to a win. Tell me a little bit about Connor Ingram and where he came from and how he jumped onto the national stage to have that sensational performance against the Avs.
Well, he's been on Preds fans' radars for quite a couple of years now. Back in 2020, before the COVID stoppage, he was the best goaltender in the AHL by far. Like maybe the best goaltender in the minors that entire season. And then after the COVID stoppage, the next year, he had some well-documented personal struggles he had to deal with. He took some time off to seek some mental health counseling. He played overseas for a little bit, kind of came back in Milwaukee. Obviously the Admirals didn't play last year, so he was kind of sharing time in Chicago. There was a lot going on there. You kind of got the sense that the plan was for him to be the Predators' main backup this past season. But clearly David Poile and John Hynes didn't want to rush him in. So they signed David Rittich to give Connor Ingram another year in the minors. And it definitely paid off because he has kind of refound the form he had before the COVID stoppage. Another phenomenal year in Milwaukee. if you ask a couple of our prospect gurus, they'll say he was maybe the main reason the Admirals made it as far in the playoffs as they did this year. But yeah, he's been on Preds fans' radars for a long time. Preds see him as a kind of a big forward-moving prospect. And I would expect fans to see a lot more of him next year, because I think you're probably going to see him as UC Saros' backup full-time.
Now, obviously, going into the series, not having Saros in the net is a huge obstacle to overcome. But what were some of the other things that led to the Predators being the team that was bounced from that first round series?
Well, they just kind of gave up the way they had been playing all season long. If you talk to Nashville fans here, they talk about team identity. The way they love to play, which is like the physical, fast moving, kind of in your face, all four lines kind of style of play, very suffocating on defense. And as the season went on, the last couple months of the season, you kind of saw holes pop up into the Predators game a little bit. They were winning games in December and January by, holding the other team to like 22, 23 shots a game, putting a lot of pressure throughout the night. Then you saw kind of games later in the year where they would survive. They would give up 40 to 45 shots a game, but somehow eke out a win. They would kind of play bad. And, those kind of spots, those little spotty performances became more frequent. And by the end of the season, really entering that Colorado series, that was just sort of the cherry on top of the dumpster fire that was the Predators' last 2 months of the season. They were just a shell of their former selves. They lost a lot of the mojo, a lot of the characteristics that made them one of the best teams at the halfway point of this season. And there's probably a little bit of blame for everybody involved to go around to that. You can blame the players for, not really staying focused long term. You can blame the coaching staff a little bit for maybe not pinpointing and fixing those mistakes. You can also maybe pinpoint some blame on the front office for not going out and being aggressive at the trade deadline and getting this core more help right now. So it was just kind of a perfect storm of dumbness that sort of sank the Nashville Predators dead in the water.
Perfect storm of dumbness, I think, is the perfect way to describe, I think, the single biggest thing that sunk the Wilds, which was special teams, power play and penalty kill, looking like they didn't know what you're supposed to do on a power play or a penalty kill. And, we've talked at length since the playoffs finished, since round one finished, that those were two weaknesses that you can't really have if you're a team that's expecting to go places once the postseason starts. So I'm going to probably borrow that one, but that I think that's a common refrain for both of these teams, is just got to the postseason after a very successful regular season, and there just were a lot of players that didn't really bring that same level of play that they had in the regular season to the postseason.
Now, we talk about, when we think about the Minnesota Wild and how good they've done this year, everybody thinks of Kaprizov, who is a phenomenal young player. I think you guys got a franchise cornerstone that you can have for years to come. One that doesn't cost you like $80 million a year, like the last two franchise cornerstones you got in free agency, where did it feel like there was enough depth behind him to do damage this year? Or was this really a case of Kaprizov is carrying this team to record heights, but maybe they don't have the depth to compete in the playoffs?
So that's a really interesting wrinkle that we're starting to kind of get into in evaluating how the season went for the Wilds. They, scoring wise, they had a lot of players who achieved career highs. Ryan Hartman, 34 goals. His previous career high was 19. You got Marcus Foligno, who was like an 11 or 12 goal a season player, and he ended up with 23. So a lot of these guys kind of had these above normal scoring seasons to propel this offense. And the wonder was if some of that was going to kind of even out. And it seemed like as the season wore on that a lot of that scoring, the other shoe dropped. And other than, say, Kevin Fiala and Matt Boldy, you didn't have guys who were like reliable scorers for this team. And with that line being basically shut down by the St. Louis Blues, like there just was nobody else that really stepped up to fill the void. And so I think that's going to be something that as we see young players come onto this roster, which we'll talk about with some of the offseason objectives, once we see some of those young players who are more like natural scorers, I think that's going to help the depth overall. But you had the two lines, the Kaprizov line, the Fiala line, who were scoring lines. You had the Joel Eriksson Ek line, who was more of a defense-oriented line that could score, but it wasn't necessarily their main focus. And then the fourth line was kind of a bruiser line who was more built on physicality than they were on scoring as well. And St. Louis just had four lines that were built on scoring and doing all the other things too. So ultimately, I think that was part of what kind of led to losing in 6, was just that you take away one of those scoring lines and it completely changed the complexity of this team, because there were two lines already whose scoring wasn't their primary focus. And it became too much for Kirill Kaprizov, despite his best efforts. It just became too much for him to try to overcome. And that's why we're here right now. And, Locked On Avs, Locked On Blues, Locked On Oilers, Locked On Flames. That's why they're all gearing up for the next game in their series.
This is a very good transition into looking ahead towards the future. What is going to happen this summer for the Predators and Wild? The Wild are in a very interesting spot. Can the Nashville Predators, they had some roster stuff of their own, could they maybe take advantage of the Wild's cap situation? We'll talk about that in just a second. But first, want to mention today's show brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. They have something new called Built Granola Bars. Yep, Built Granola Bars come in 3 unbelievable flavors: chocolate peanut butter, chocolate coconut, and white chocolate berry. Hey, and if you can't decide between those 3, you want to try all 3, you can get a mix box at Built.com right now. These are so different from the normal Built Bars and the Built Bar Puffs. Built Bar granola is loaded with granola. Yeah, makes sense, right? It's the perfect combination of crunch and chewiness, but just like bars and puffs, these babies are packed with protein and covered in 100% real chocolate. With 150 calories, 15 grams of protein, and only 4 grams of sugar, Built granola bars will change your world. Built has cracked the code to better granola. They're the perfect healthy snack to pack in your lunch, take on the road, or just, eat as a snack if you're trying to eat full during the day. And they're made with collagen protein, which your body absorbs more efficiently and provides tons of other health benefits. So if you've been waiting for a healthy and delicious granola bar to hit the market, this is your time. Head to Built.com right now to get the Built granola bars. 3 delicious flavors to try: chocolate peanut butter, chocolate coconut, and white chocolate berry. Don't miss out. Get yours today. Go to Built.com and use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. Again, that is promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com.
Continuing today's special crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Predators. And as mentioned, for your second listen of the day, make sure to check out those shows of teams still alive in the Western Conference playoffs: Locked On Avalanche, Locked On Blues, Locked On Flames, Locked On Oilers. Some incredible series between those two teams. Battle of Alberta has been insane. And so make sure to get the best intel on those two teams from the best insiders for the NHL. Locked On Flames, Locked On Oilers, Locked On Avs, Locked On Blues are all available wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Nick, let's look at some off-season topics for both of these teams. I want to start from the Predators angle. Did have a chance to see a little bit of the comments from Predators upper management after the season, and it did sound like there are going to be some changes for this Predators team coming. So what do you see being, is there going to be a big roster shakeup for the Predators, or is it a situation where there may be a little bit of a scale back while keeping the parts of the team that work the best intact?
Well, they can't really afford to kind of go into this offseason haphazardly. They've done that, the past couple of trade deadlines. They've done that the past couple off seasons. David Poile now infamously sort of said before last season, this is going to be a competitive rebuild, where he was going to kind of, have some people still on hand, try to go for it, but kind of bring in younger people, try to retool this roster a little bit. Uh, he can't really do that anymore. He has got to pick a line, or like pick a side of a line. Is he going to tear this down and rebuild, which he says he's absolutely not going to do, nor should he, to be honest, because you've had a team that has made all but 3 playoffs since 2004. So why would you? And then, on the other hand, do you go all in? Do you look at the season Roman Josi had? Do you look at Philip Forsberg and Matt Duchene and say these are 240 goal scorers? And do you look at UC Saros, who is a Vezina caliber goaltender, should have been nominated last year? That's a different topic. Do you look at all them and say, okay, there are clearly pieces here. We need to go all in and build around these pieces? That seems to be sort of what Poile is hinting at here. Now, I don't know if it was just fan service, but he made a point to mention that he can spend up to the cap this offseason. He said that management says it's okay. He said he didn't do that the past couple of years because he didn't feel like he had the roster. He said now he kind of feels like he may be able to do that. He has mentioned that he is going to swing big for the fences no matter whether Philip Forsberg comes back. That's kind of off-season news number one in Nashville. Is Philip Forsberg going to come back? Forsberg seems like he wants to come back. David Poile clearly wants Forsberg back. It's just a matter of money, which is kind of an interesting thing when you think back to the the Ryan Suter fiasco, which was 10 years ago this summer. There was more happening there than just how much do you want to pay? Do you want to come back? With Forsberg, it really does seem as simple as, do you want to be back? Yes, we do. Okay, now what's the contract? How much are we going to pay you? That seems to be the main issue there right now. But either way, I don't anticipate the Predators sort of being a passive player. I would expect them to be in the mix for a couple of big names. Or, if they strike out on one of the big prizes, if for some reason they don't bring Forsberg back, if they don't have Johnny Gaudreau as a plan B or something like that, they're still going to be active. And I think there's still going to be a team that brings in multiple pieces. So I think this will be not necessarily a new look team next year, but a team with a lot more firepower than they had going into this season.
Well, and there are going to be opportunities, I feel like, this offseason of teams who just have a roster that really has peaked, has reached like it's the highest level that they can, that are going to jettison pieces. And, the Wild are obviously in a situation with Kevin Fiala being anticipated to be dealt. I struggle with the wording of that because, it seems like it's pretty well written in ink how it's going to happen, but you got to leave the opportunity for something else entirely to happen. But there are going to be other teams in both conferences who kind of look at where they're at and they say, you know what, I don't know if we can do much more with this group that we have. And so, as you mentioned, even having those top level guys as the objectives in the offseason, if you miss out on those, there is potential to be creative to try to swing deals other ways that can lead to you getting, some of the same things that you're looking for.
And what's the move for the Wild? Because you bring up an interesting point that you guys have this great core, like this great core that you finally put together. You guys finally got an exciting team. And then boom, it just seems like next year that the cap monster just came out of nowhere. So, is there something creative that you guys can do that maybe doesn't involve you having to cut either a Kevin Fiala loose or Matthew Dumba loose? Is there some creativity to be had there that maybe you pull out a surprise and you're able to keep some of these, exciting players together for a little bit longer?
Well, it's going to take something like that to make it happen. And, I hadn't even thought of this, but interesting to note that, Ryan Suter, being now a former Predator and former member of the Minnesota Wild, has now another coach that has been let go in his wake, with Rick Bowness being shown the door. And so wherever Suter goes, it seems like things change after he's there and after he leaves.
Did you hear the Jason Arnott podcast about him? How about
Yep.
did you get that same sort of sense in Minnesota? Was there a little bit more drama behind the scenes?
Yeah, I'm not privy to everything that happened, but it has been pretty well circulated that he wasn't a super great teammate, and that I don't think it's a coincidence that you hear with the locker room chemistry that this team has now, because they feel like everybody in that locker room has equal footing. I don't think those word choices or those comments coming out, I don't think that's a coincidence. And you hear some of the things from his former teammates, like, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah, it's interesting, but at least, hey, now we have somebody else. This is me shaking across the screen here. We have somebody else to share the Ryan Suter hatred fan club with. So welcome aboard, Seth and Minnesota Wild fans.
Happy to be here. In terms of the right move, I've been pretty adamant that if you're looking at building this core going forward, it's Kirill Kaprizov, obviously. Matt Boldy, as a 20-year-old, looked really, really good. And so he's obviously in that core group as well. You got some of the prospects. You got Marco Rossi. I'd put Jesper Wallstedt, our phenom goalie prospect, in that mix as well. I am ready myself to put Kevin Fiala in that grouping. And so it's unfortunate that it's at the situation, and this is largely due to the contracts that Parise and Suter signed. It is being kind of looked at as you really only have option A, keep Kevin Fiala, or option B, keep Matt Dumba. Like it's been worked into either or. But even after hearing some of the comments Bill Guerin has had as to where this process seems to be going, I still, in the back of my head, am like, if anybody has a different way to do this, it's going to be Bill Guerin. And I just don't get the sense, in my head, it seems like it's going to be really difficult to replace a 30-goal, 85-point scorer who is turning 25 and is headed into the prime of his career. You don't just stumble into those guys. And if I, as somebody that covers this team, can rationalize that in my head, I would assume that a general manager either has already or has a different way at looking at this entire scenario that not anybody else but him has come up with. And so it's not going to surprise me at all if all of a sudden we get to draft night or sometime before and a trade gets announced and the Minnesota Wild have traded into the top 10 for a pick, and the name gets announced as to who's being traded, and everybody is like, why is it not? It's not Kevin Fiala. Who is it? So if anybody has come up with a different way to make this all work that is not being widely reported, it's Bill Guerin.
You can also just go the Tampa Bay or Vegas route and just hope one of your highly paid depth players has some mystery long-term injured reserve quality injury.
Well, and looking at it too, like Ottawa, there was a report today that the Senators are willing to move the 7th overall pick in the draft. Very specifically worded in that is that they are seeking a top 4 defenseman in return. What is Matt Dumba for the Minnesota Wild?
A top,
Top
4
4
defenseman.
defenseman. Also, you look at any of those other top 4 guys that the Minnesota Wild have, I would say Jonas Brodin is probably off limits. Jared Spurgeon's another name. There have been a lot of people in the Wild's fan sphere that have pointed that as a potential. So that's obviously super, super hot takey. But, that's the kind of things is like a GM is looking at that and saying, would that be a route we go?
And it's interesting that you say that and you bring up trade specifically because the Nashville Predators are a team that can take advantage of some of these teams that are having to sell off players. David Boyle mentioned that whether Forsberg comes back or not, he's got, some plan A's, plan B's, plan C's in place for how he wants to refresh this roster. And look, if the Predators are dead set on refreshing this roster and still remaining competitive, then they may be in the mix for, hey, if Kevin Fiala's up on the block, he's familiar with this organization. Maybe there is sort of a two-way thing that works out with the Minnesota Wild. We know Preds and Wild like making trades or swapping players, so we know that. And I also expect the Preds to maybe kick the tires on some other players around the league. Look, we have seen David Boyle is not afraid to pull the trigger on a big out of nowhere kind of trade. I mean, we have seen it with the trade we're going to talk about here in a little bit. We've seen it with PK Subban for Shea Weber. We've seen it, for Patrick Hornquist for James Neal. These sort of trades that, seem like they just came out of nowhere. So would the Predators maybe be a trade partner with the Wild if Kevin Fiala is one of the people you're putting out there? Could they, sort of bring the band back together? Maybe him and Mikael Granlund on the same line to kind of tie this all together. Would they go out, maybe kick the tires on somebody like JT Miller? Do they have enough that Vancouver would maybe be interested in? Do they go to a team like, the Vegas Golden Knights, who clearly have some cap issues, and maybe say, you know what, William Karlsson may be a good middle 6 player we're interested in. We have the cap space. Let's talk. Somebody like that. So the Preds, I think when you talk about some of these teams like the Wild having cap issues, maybe being forced to make a move this summer, or just a team that's maybe to look to refresh their core, the Predators keep that team in mind because we may be a trade partner for you guys.
Yeah, it's like when the garage sale season comes about and you may not necessarily have anything that you're looking to put up for sale, but just for the sake of everybody else having a garage sale, you're like, well, maybe it's time to take a peek. So, boy, that was not an angle that I had anticipated, but Kevin Fiala being on the same line as Mikael Granlund in a trade that'd be quite the full circle picture. So
that would shut up our Twitter comments so fast.
I don't know what I would do if that happened, but it's safe to say that is a trade that has, it seems like one that has certainly led to some interesting things for both teams. And so to finish up today's crossover, let's talk Kevin Fiala for Mikael Granlund. We will do that after this.
First, though, I want to mention today's show brought to you by our partners at BetOnline. BetOnline continues to be the #1 source for all of your betting needs and sports info. You can find the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's basketball playoffs, Major League Baseball scores, fights, even next season's NFL futures, and of course, everything you need to know about the Stanley Cup playoffs. BetOnline is also your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, from live betting, playoffs, esports, and more. Plenty of props and odds for the Stanley Cup playoffs, lots of different games, plenty to check out. So if you're feeling a little bit frisky, think you can put some money down on some of these games, Bet Online has you covered with everything you need to know to make an informed decision and maybe walk away with some money. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet Online, where the game starts.
Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild and Locked on Predators. Seth Topol joined by Nick Morgan of Locked on Preds. And the big trade that these two teams had a few years ago. Shout out to Paul Fenton for being the one to pull the trigger on that trade. Kevin Fiala for Mikael Granlund. And Granlund was a player here in Minnesota that was a nice player for the team. And it just never seemed like I don't know. I think fans wanted him to do a little more than he did, and always was kind of saddled with the first round playoff losses. A team is like a fringe playoff team, and they get to the playoffs, they get bounced, there's frustrations, and you're like, well, if such and such player would have done better. And so I think some of that first round losing kind of hung over Granlund. And so then you trade to Nashville for a young up-and-comer in Kevin Fiala, and it kind of seems like Fiala is in a similar spot, although Fiala, I think, has blossomed into a very legitimate goal scorer since he came to Minnesota.
Sure. And, you talk about Granlund, kind of before this trade, who he was for the Wild. You could kind of say the same thing about Fiala on the Predators. He was on the Predators' second line for 2 years. They clearly were trying to get him going, but for whatever reason, he just didn't click early on. And I'm sure a lot of that may be due to the fact that he was just kind of a young player still finding his footing. And Peter Laviolette sort of ran a unforgiving system. There was some other stuff going on there, but for whatever reason, it just didn't click. And he didn't really look like he was becoming the player the Predators expected him to become. And then, so at the time, Fiala was a fan favorite. A lot of people in Nashville really liked him. A lot of had high hopes for him, but they were excited to bring in a player like Mikael Granlund, who had, I think it was like a 70-point season the year before the trade, who kind of had a habit of putting up some big numbers for the Minnesota Wild, was, well respected as a playmaker. So I thought a lot of people kind of saw that as, Fiala might be a good player someday, but Granlund is a good player right now. And then it just took a really long time for him to kind of find his footing in Nashville. And I think that's where, from the Preds fans' perspective, they may have soured a little bit on this trade at first. I think they were expecting Granlund to come in and sort of be, this, dynamic playmaker that unlocks everybody's full potential. And it really wasn't until Peter Laviolette got fired and John Hines came in that you saw Granlund kind of being like, okay, I think he's starting to work into the system a little bit. And it's funny because you look at the way Mikael Granlund plays now, his style of play and how he's being used, it is nowhere's close to how he was being used in Minnesota. I mean, he's a really good, like, two-way defensive center. Mm-hmm. He's kind of, the first guy that's out there on the penalty kill. He's this kind of Swiss Army knife player. He has kind of unlocked a completely new level to his game. So I think part of the reason Preds fans are a little upset is that he isn't the 80-point scorer that we thought we were getting when the trade happened, but he has still become a very important player for the Nashville Predators.
Yeah, and it goes to, like, always with these types of trades, a couple of years after they happen, I think the natural response is to look at, like, well, what if we did the same trade now for, like, just reversed it? And, the Wild had Granlund in the mix and the Preds had Fiala in the mix. And, it's interesting because we're at the point where it seems like Fiala is going to get traded. And so then we'll take that and look at that trade if that is how things go. I don't know. It's fascinating because the Wild have had plenty of these trades that haven't worked out necessarily for them. Nino Niederreiter for Victor Rask. That one. Yeah, not great. The all-in deadline acquisition of Martin Hanzal, that worked out great. Any number of examples that have not, but then, like the Devin Dubnyk trade from a few years ago, that worked out well at the beginning. Even this past year, Marc-Andre Fleury being traded for Nick Delorier, Jacob Middleton, all those guys. And, we still ended up seeing a first-round exit. So trades can go any number of ways. And, it's fascinating to see a few years later, like how things end up playing out, especially in this case.
Yeah, and it's going to be a matter of perspective, no matter what, no matter which way you look at it. If let's say you trade a key player, let's say you're a team that's close to a cup, you bring in a big name player for a prospect. The immediate player helps you win a Stanley Cup and then winds up signing somewhere else. Meanwhile, that prospect you traded is a perennial all-star every year, but the team he's on isn't closer to a cup. A lot of people would, do you say that was a successful trade because the player you brought in helped you get that cup, even though they were only there for a couple of months? Or do you look at that and say, this is a disaster because, look, the young prospect we traded is scoring 30 goals for his new team, even though they're kind of treading water? And whoever you ask is going to have a different answer to that. It's just a matter of perspective. And so it depends on what perspective you look at this Fiala Granlund trade for. It's like, do you look at this? Is Granlund what you expected to get if you're a Predators fan? Is Fiala what you expected to get when you're a Wild fan? In that case, then this is a really good 1-for-1 trade. If they're not meeting your expectations so far, or I don't know from your end, if the Wild have to wind up trading Fiala for cap reasons, maybe they see that as, a bad move.
Yeah, it's going to depend. Then you have the byproduct. If Fiala is traded, then he'll be compared. The Granlund trade will then be compared to what we get back in return for him. And so you got like all these onion layers. But at the end of the day, I think it's, as it was described as when it happened, a good old-fashioned hockey trade that I think worked out for both teams. And beyond this season, what it leads to is really anybody's guess. And I think that's where we're going to leave it here for today. We'll do another crossover as we get further into the off season, as Locked On Wild does the 31 teams in 31 days. We're going to make that happen this year. So we'll definitely do this later on in the off season, but thank you for tuning in to our crossover episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Predators. And make sure to follow both teams all off season long with new content coming every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.